I'd love to welcome a couple of key speakers who will share a little bit about what they do here, why they're here today, as well as their experience with gifted education. Can I please welcome Ronan from CGA? Can I please welcome Kate from Pegasus Education? And Dom from Gifted Minds. Woo! Sorry to the sound people if I keep wooing in the microphone. Come join us, everyone. I think the mics are off, but if you can turn them on when you get up on stage, we'll kick things off. Yes, thank you, Sid. Yes, thank you. Yeah, welcome. Now, I was saying it's a bit funny being in this situation that I'm hosting an event, but I'm definitely not the expert on the panel. So all these three lovely speakers have a lot more experience with education than I do. But I'd love to firstly get each speaker to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about what you do and how you help students and parents in the gifted education space.
My name's Kate Barton. I'm from Newcastle, and I have worked in schools as a gifted education coordinator from kindergarten through to year 12. And in particular, I have had an interest in early gifted education because it's often overlooked in schools. Schools tend to have gifted education programs starting from middle primary onwards. And K-2 can be a really painful start for your child if they're gifted, and you can often see this little spark from your bright child just fade after they start school, which is really disheartening because these kids have usually been really looking forward to school. This is going to be a place where I'm going to learn and do lots of interesting things, and then it doesn't pan out like that. So I offer consultancy to parents about gifted education and also work with schools to help train their staff in gifted education. Over to you, Dom.
Alrighty. Sure
You've got your glasses on already, you're ready to go then?
Ready to go. Nice to meet everyone here. Some people I know. My name is Dominic Westbrook. I work in a therapeutic capacity with gifted kids based out of the eastern suburbs in Sydney, in Coogee. I've been doing that for about 8 years now with my mother, Fiona Smith, who is over there at our table, and she does the cognitive assessments. She's been working in this field for 35-ish years. No, 40? 30. No, she's not in her 80s, thankfully. I'll be in trouble for that one. And working with kids on a myriad of things. It can be social, it can be perfectionistic issues, it can be anything really that is so endemic within the gifted populations. And as Kate was saying, probably the time that I see kids most often is after school. So I see them when they are dysregulated or masking from a whole day of pretending to be something that they're not, or on a level that they're not. So I work and see gifted kids quite often at their most dysregulated. And that's what we work through a lot of the time. Yeah.
Ronan.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Ronan Kearney, and I am currently the Deputy Principal at CGA, which Alex has introduced. It's our online high school. And my work is kind of across both our campuses, largely to do with the academic side, but also linking across and working with our pastoral teams. So the work that I do is looking at our curriculum, firstly making sure it is acceptable and at the level we believe it should be for each individual year. That is not just following the textbook and what it says, but thinking about the skills that need to be embedded for students, particularly now with so many changes like AI coming in, and how we embed that practically from our junior years through the school so that they are successful. But then also looking individually at our students and how we support them. So that is looking at how we build programs for scholarship, how we build extracurriculars, particularly as an online school as well. And I also supervise our inclusion manager, who's really there for both our gifted students, our twice exceptional students, and students who have a learning need that needs supported in school so that they can be as successful as they should be able to be. And yeah, really kind of supervising and supporting that across our worldwide campuses, and ensuring that students and parents have that voice within our school, and that we are reflective about what we're doing to make sure it's the support that our families need.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ronan. We'll get into the first question for the day, but obviously, we would love our families to join the conversation. We'll be doing some ability to text some questions through in a little bit later on. But the first panel is around identification, advocacy, and academic mismatch. Kate, you said you work with a lot of young students. How does giftedness often show up on a day-to-day basis at home? Because I know there's some families who are here today who are suspecting that their child is gifted, might not have a formal diagnosis, but like they're getting a sense that their child is not like every other 5 or 6 year old.
Yeah, so often actually I speak with parents and it's their first child, it's either an only child or their oldest child, and so this is all very new to them and they don't have a comparator. When you have a second one, the differences can often become quite apparent. But what you'll notice at home is a very, very rapid acquisition of any sort of new learning, new concepts. They're often really interested in particular fields that are very niche to them, and they will know every single thing about that particular area. They're often highly sensitive children, and really interested in sort of big questions in the world. So, like Sid was talking about, he's interested in politics and wanting to know how the world works and watch budget night, etc. And even really young kids can be really interested in that sort of thing, but they are often highly sensitive. So, your 5-year-old might be crying at what they see on the news because that's not right and that's not the way the world should be. They will be picking up things around them from around the world and asking lots and lots of questions, which often happen at bedtime, usually when you're trying to get them into, and very existential questions. So, not the typical sort of 5-year-old questions, but things like, Mummy, Daddy, what's the difference between your soul and your spirit? Things that you think, God, that's so profound, I don't even know how to answer that myself. But they're often interested in these really deep existential sort of questions. And you can tell them apart from high-achieving children who are ones that are very bright and do well at school, because those sorts of children are interested in the topics that are taught at school and will apply themselves to those topics. But gifted kids often go off on a tangent and want to think about all sorts of esoteric and quite unusual sort of subjects. Tom?
Sorry, let's just leave this on. Absolutely. I recall when I actually started working with the gifted population maybe 8 years ago now, one of my first clients was this absolutely lovely little girl, and precocious is an understatement, and she was in year 4, I think at the time, and she was devastated and told me through tears how she couldn't understand how the other people in her year weren't as worried as her about the plight of the Himalayan snow leopard. And of course, all the other kids were like, they couldn't care less. They wanted to talk about, what was going on. And that's not the other kid's fault, of course, but there is a difference in terms of what the interest and emotional attachment is for that little girl, and she couldn't figure it out. And that again is something that I work through with these kids, this idea of a difference of, emotional attachment and what they are interested in can be so much varied, as you were saying, Kate, to the average kid, which, it isn't, again, anything about the average. It's just that these kids like different things, and there's a different impetus there for discovery, which she couldn't quite understand. So, yeah, very much spot on.
And Ronan, how does that play out for you as a teacher?
Yeah, I think what teachers tend to see from that side is, again, as well, rapid consolidation of knowledge within certain topic areas, deeper conceptual understanding potentially than their peers, and that's where then I think it leads into that emotional connection and really caring about, because they've processed it at a much deeper level than their peers may currently be able to do. And partly what can then happen as they go up through school is that can then come across to in the classroom as boredom, because the topics aren't moving at the pace they need them to move. The depth of understanding required in the topics isn't the depth that they need to be able to work at to actually keep the momentum and keep the enjoyment of learning. And I think those are quite key bits that, whenever we're talking about the acceleration or the different ways of pacing for students to actually be able to work at the level that they need to, that comes across. And I think one of the bigger things for education as well is, not for the students, but for the teachers, proper and sufficient training of actually how to work with gifted students in your classroom, because that is a key aspect. It isn't a one-off day on a course, it is regular PD to actually how do you support the learners in front of you.
At home, can I just say, Alex?
Yeah, of course.
What you will notice is that with this sense of justice, it often plays out with siblings. As, what's fair, and I'm only going to do my chores if they, it's all very tit for tat because everything has to be very fair. And they usually grow hit developmental milestones very rapidly. So when you go for those early childhood checks, they're often kids who are walking earlier and talking earlier and will verbalize in full sentences very early on. And lots of them these hyperlexic children teach themselves to read. And parents don't even know how they've done it. You're driving along and they're reading a sign and you're thinking, well, how did they do that? So there's lots of little signs.
Yeah, absolutely. Dom, do you want to add to that?
Yeah. I mean, just to touch on that point you made about a kind of, wider, teaching of teachers about gifted kids. I mean, on a personal level, I was pretty bored at school in primary school, but I found satiation in the social. So that was enough for me to a certain extent. I mean, my parents did a lot as well, took me to the zoo a lot of the time, things like that. But I remember one teacher I had, and I don't think she had necessarily much, training in gifted kids or creative divergent kids, but she was so interested in how I learnt that year 5 was hands down the best year of my primary school. Even though she might not have had the most accolades or had the most training or anything like that, she was just generally curious about how I learnt, and that made that year a shining beacon in an otherwise, kind of, boring quagmire. Thank you, Kate, for the terminology.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to guess for our parents here, is what our panelists saying sound familiar to you? If it is, just raise your hand. If it feels somewhat familiar, okay. Is there anything that kind of is standing out right now where it's like, oh, this is not really me. This is not really our situation. Okay, that's good. That means you're on track. Okay. Talking about the right stuff then, the right people, which is always good to see. In terms of like how this interacts, I mean, we're here to kind of talk about what role the parents play in translating what they're seeing at home to what a school might know about their child. And certainly in my role in admissions, I speak to parents of gifted kids, and they know so much about their kid, how they learn, what they like, what time of day they prefer to learn at, and what kind of characteristics of the teacher they best, So it's a lot of information to take on in an admission side, and often I'm talking to Ronan and being like, what does this mean for you as a teacher as well? But in terms of like, how do you then translate what you're seeing at home to what might be happening during the school day? What role do things like formal assessments play? These types of things as well. Do you have any comments about like how parents can start that process of, this is what I'm seeing at home, this is what a school might actually want to know about what my kid's doing at home?
Okay, so usually parents start their kids at school and then the wheels fall off somewhere quickly. So that's when I sort of see them. It's not going as it should. But I have spoken to some people here who are quite proactively thinking, oh, this isn't going to go well when he gets to school. Because he's already reading and doing year 7 maths, etc. So go to your school, I'd say, please have a positive mindset and look at it as a partnership first. Usually you're constrained by where you are living geographically and where the schools are available to you. So go in trying to be positive about it and go in with whatever objective evidence that you have to hand. So if your child has participated in extracurricular or just goes online and does Khan Academy maths or mathletics or whatever, take in that independent objective evidence. If they've had a formal psychometric evaluation, that's like gold to a teacher. I love it because no one's interested in their full-scale IQ, but the sub-scores on that are hugely valuable for teachers to break down what their strengths and weaknesses are. And otherwise, keep a log at home as parents of the behaviors that you observe, the things like perfectionistic tendencies, they have to get everything just right. And that might not be just about work they're doing, but, their bedroom has to be arranged in a really particular way. Projects that they've done themselves, they often, will get on. And I've had children come up and they've done their own PowerPoint presentations, 100 slides long about Genghis Khan's empire, etc. And they're 6, 7 years old. I had a child who came to me with a Star Wars game that he had made. It must have taken up about 6 cereal packets chopped up to make. He had immense knowledge of every single planet, character, everything. The complexity of the game rules were phenomenal. And those sorts of things, bring those products to your teachers so that they can see what your child is thinking and doing, what their interests are, but also the complexity and the depth that goes into those things that they will spend hours doing.
Yeah, absolutely, Kate. I mean, on the other hand as well, it's interesting. We get a lot of parents coming in to us who obviously are aware that their child is precocious or early verbal or whatever it is, but it's actually the start of some type of scholastic endeavor, which starts to, you start to see these kind of differences, because in the family home, it's just normal, it's normalized. All their abilities are, in their siblings, parents. It's not, you're not all the same age in your family. Obviously, it's when they start in that environment that you start to see these kind of frustrations, boredoms come out, then behavioral affectations because of these. Like, it can often be the impetus for parents to come to us, is because, my kids just started preschool or kindy, stuff's hitting the fan, what's happening there? So it can almost be, what's normal at home in that environment isn't what's kind of, it's just obviously a lot more rigid and at school, and that's when it can kind of come out, and that's when a lot of parents, come to us for support.
Ronan, it's obviously like a bit of an interesting one. As an ability-based school, we do see a lot of students who are gifted. What kind of evidence or information do you ideally want to see from a family when they're saying, this is my child and this is how best to work with them?
Yeah, it's pretty much, I was nodding along as Kate spoke, because it's everything that she said there in terms of if there's work that they've been doing at home that's, above and beyond what is expected for their age range, bringing that in as evidence is just really clear for teachers to be able to say, okay, this is where they're at, so where do they need to be, and where do they need to be challenged in school. Any form of psychometric assessments are obviously great. What we do at our school is any students who are gifted or may have an inclusion need, they meet with our inclusion manager so that the parents and the child have that conversation before they go into any classrooms. And that way the inclusion manager then has a profile built from the information from the parents, from the child, to give to our teachers first. And it's also that opportunity of looking at where is correct placement. And again, because we are ability based, it is easier for us to do that than it is for physical schools, absolutely. But we have that freedom to actually be able to say, okay, maths, particularly with these scores, probably at least a year up. We can see how the first few weeks go. It might need to be another year up. English maybe year appropriate for now. And there's a lot of freedom that we have there. Within a sort of physical school environment, I think one of the key bits, as you said, is the partnership. Don't view that meeting as a one-off. I've given them the documentation, they're on top of it now. There has to be regular checkpoints that as a parent you're coming and going, okay, where has been the growth? I already know that they potentially know all of the maths for this year, but how have they been able to grow in that subject? Is there, appropriate extension, which is not another worksheet because they finished early. It's that conceptual depth, it's that increasing understanding that needs to be there, and partnering with the school to help build, and you say, positive conversations around that. What is possible, what might need to be outside of school, but being open to that conversation about what they can support with and what might need to go alongside that as well.
Yeah, I think as well from our side in admissions, it's kind of like trying to help parents understand what we as a school like to see in terms of actual evidence. Because there's a lot of parents who will say, oh, my child is reading a year 10 textbook and they read some Shakespeare the other day and, therefore they must be year 10 or 11 English and maths and these types of things. and you're like, oh, okay, like, is that a true kind of reflection of your child's ability? Or did they just randomly pick up a textbook and were flicking through it, but they otherwise don't have any understanding? So I think it's like understanding that you as a parent are seeing one thing, but obviously like when you're talking to an educator or a teacher or someone who's been in the industry for a long time and work with a lot of kids, sometimes they need to see some concrete evidence of that, and so that's why like CGA is a part-time, IGCSE qualification. That is as concrete as it gets, really, because it's very hard to just skim the IGCSE and do well in it, for example. So what would you say for parents who are kind of saying, well, I've been asking my school to advance my kid because they're doing X, Y, Z. What would you say is like more concrete? Khan Academy, these types of things, but a student could gloss over that once or twice. What feels more concrete to a school?
I have had parents, so I've worked in a school that has an accelerated pathway or advanced pathways from kindergarten right through, and I've had parents come in wanting to get their child into the gifted pathway, which is a pull-out program for maths and English, which is their full-time maths and English being taught there, and said, look, this is what they're doing at home, but clearly the handwriting is not the child's handwriting, and obviously this is the parent has sat down with the child and done the work with them. So what teachers want to see is what the child can do independently without any prompting, and what's driving that child and what's driving their interests. So anything that they've done independently, and if your child is already at a school now, ask your school, and if you're thinking about going to CGA or moving them to a different school, ask for any progressive achievement tests that they will have done at that school, which are typically carried out by pretty much every New South Wales public-private school, independent school at the end of every year. So those are called PAT tests, and they are a measure of your child's achievement. So that's how well they are learning the content that they are taught at school. Some schools will do ability testing, and the difference with an ability test is a measure of your child's cognitive strength across different areas, usually verbal reasoning, non-verbal, and quantitative reasoning. And those tests will either probably be a COGAT test, COGAT standing for Cognitive Abilities, or a CAT4, which is run by just a different company. But those assessments are completed by some schools on children to look at their innate natural ability. You can't prepare for them, you can't study for them. So ask your schools if they have any ability testing and achievement testing. And that a really good thing to look for there is if your child's ability testing is putting them on the 97th percentile, but their achievement is about 70, and it's a really good sign that they're a gifted child that's underachieving at school, either through boredom or then just disinterested, or they need some sort of intervention. So any sort of assessments like that. And also things like external competitions. So if your child's had a chance to take part in a maths Olympiad or a science games or writing a Whitlam What Matters essay or any sort of externally mediated competitions, those are really good objective sort of assessments that you can take to schools to show this is what my child is capable of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when parents come to us for the psychometric assessment, I mean, it is usually out of a desire to take it to a school to show a certain thing. It can be, obviously, it's curiosity as well. And coming down to the parents, I mean, I think since I've been working in Gifted Minds 8 years, but I think talking to Fiona as well, in her 25, 30 years, I'll get it right this time, rarely does she do a Whisk 5 on a kid who is not at least gifted, 97, 90. There's variance, obviously, in which fields and which subtests they do perform in, but very rarely does she have to look a parent in the face and say, kid's average. You know what I mean? So that intuition and perception of the parents is generally accurate in terms of let's go get an intelligence assessment, probably because they have been taking notice of all these things like early verbalizations, or also similarities that they had with their own schooling experience or their own growing up, because giftedness is heritable as well. You know what I mean? There's so many times working with a gifted kid, I've also kind of worked with the gifted parents as well, because they're like, oh, I actually had similar experiences in school, and then it opens up a whole new connection with the kid that you can talk to them about those experiences that you had and how you obviously different time and education is thankfully becoming more flexible, which I think is the is the key to a happy gifted child, is flexibility and variability. That's why something like CGA for me personally would have been so good. Why weren't you guys around in the OOs, bro? Come on.
Yeah, I don't know how good the internet was back then, unfortunately.
Couldn't cop it, I don't think.
I just wanted to see from the audience, how many people have actually sought out a formal assessment, a WISC or a WIAT or any of these terminologies before? Oh, wow. That's awesome. Who is learning these terminologies for the first time today? Okay, welcome. It's a bit to catch up on, for sure. WISC and WIATs and all these things. I know, like, when a parent sends one to me, Ronan, I'm like, I can see there's numbers and a lot of words, but I'm not the expert. What do you look for when you see a WISC or a WIAT being sent through?
Yeah, so what we're really looking at there, as I said, is the sort of ability levels across the different categories, and our inclusion manager has the effectively what is the international SENCO qualification, specifically for working with and interpreting scores and being able to then speak to families about those scores. So effectively we're looking at subtests to look at where their percentiles are higher or lower than what would be average for their age, and then using that as an indicator of that they may need support, they may need acceleration within the classroom. Alongside that, at the beginning of the academic year, we use the Cambridge Chem tests, which are one of those ability rather than knowledge check tests, and look at those core profiles of cognitive skills to actually then be able to look internally ourselves that potentially there are some gifted students whose parents were not yet fully aware of that and are being placed in the normal year group, but actually would be better off being accelerated. And equally, it can show up if there's any particular areas. We work with a lot of EAL, second language speakers as well, in our Northern Hemisphere school. So making sure that for our teachers, again, they understand the difference between struggling because English is not your first language and struggling with the subject, because they're two very different things that can be conflated a lot for second language speakers. So they're really useful for us for that as well. And then, if they're coming in from other schools, a lot of international schools use the GL Cat 4 now. So having that is very similar to having an educational psychologist report for us. We can look at those scores and make our interpretations for best placement. And that's again why we'd like all of that to happen before the first class, because then we can go back to the parents and say, well, we did notice this, have you thought about? And then have that conversation before they start, so there's minimal disruption for the student coming into the school.
Nice.
Yeah, as parents, if you can ask for those, if they've done the Cat 4 test, you could, maybe save yourself $1,000 or $2 on getting a WISC or a WIAT done if your school is receptive to receive, looking at those assessments. And the other thing I thought of when Ronan was talking about EAL students was they're really handy tests if you've got a twice exceptional child, because often those kids don't appear in the classroom to be particularly exceptional in terms of intelligence, but that's because it's masked by, ASD, dyslexia, ADHD, some specific learning difficulty that they've got. And when you look at their profiles on a WISC 5, they very often have a general ability index, which is a cumulative of some of the subscores, which is quite high, but their working memory or their processing speed is really low, and it really classically looks like that. So they are actually really gifted kids, but they're really tricky to teach, actually, those kids, because they think very deeply, but their processing speed is extremely slow. So in the classroom, they're quite tricky as a teacher to manage, but they do need the extension and enrichment to keep them satisfied.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was talking to Fiona before today's session, and we were talking about how the perception of giftedness is viewed in some schools, and how some schools are very on board with it. They do a lot of teacher training around it. They have a lot of programs and support, and other teachers are skeptical about giftedness in general. They either don't think a student, they're just high achieving, but otherwise, there's other areas that they're not doing too well in, so that kid is not really that exceptional, really. That's the approach some teachers might have. How should parents go about kind of identifying if their child's teacher this particular year is perhaps not that on board with, Whisk and Wyatt, and not really that on board with the whole concept of giftedness? Is that a sign that a family needs to move school, or is that a sign that they try and educate the teacher? Is that the role that the parent should try and take on? Or, I'm sure that's a pretty sticky situation that happens more often than not. I'm sure, Dom, you deal with families in that situation a lot.
Yeah, I mean, that can, again, be an impetus for them coming to see us, like just a disconnect and a dysynchrony between the kid and the teacher. And that really is the number one import. Like, you can have the best gifted setup in the school, you can have everything going, everything motoring along, but if there's not a rapport between the gifted kid and the teacher, which doesn't necessarily fall, I mean, obviously you prefer a teacher with gifted experience, and because that would suggest that they'd be more flexible and be more, allow more flexibility and variance with the gifted kid. Gifted kids hate being condescended to. I remember feeling so condescended to as a young kid, especially in school, and the punishment was always unfair, and there was ironies, and I'd see teachers doing, I remember saying, I think, a swear word, but I think it was not really a swear word, in year 4, and then I heard the teacher say it in the playground to another teacher, and I was like, why aren't they living up to the standards?
That's your gifted sense of justice.
Exactly.
There,
I was like, this
fair.
is BS. So I made sure I said that word many more times that week, and then I think I got in more trouble. So yeah, I think the relationship between the teacher, as I said before, like I had one good year in primary school, not because I was gifted, not because of anything, but because I had a curious teacher who was genuinely interested in how I learn. And I think that kind of came down to probably her own creative, divergent way of thinking, and also probably a gifted teacher herself, and an almost an subconscious mutual understanding between us that, we kind of understood each other to a certain extent. And I think, I think the more authoritarian teaching style, authoritative teachers, fantastic, where there's kind of a deal with the kids, you know what I mean? They understand why they can't do something. They can understand why there's this in place. There's boundaries, but they're talked about and they're visible. It's when a punishment is indivisible and vague that gifted kids get really annoyed and see it. That's when they start getting confrontational. So, yeah, like obviously gifted learning and teachers' gifted experience, vital, but I think even more vital is, the curiosity of the teacher in understanding how that kid wants to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such a interesting thing that you would hope that, I think a lot of parents come into a school and they say, I've heard it's a good school. Everyone says it's a good school. For some reason, my child hates it. And they don't really get my child as much. I always say to parents, pick the school that suits your child, not the school that everyone else thinks is a good school, right? Pick the school that's actually a fit for you and your child, not what everyone else thinks.
Yeah, go around the school and have a look first and meet the people. Like, you can't go to CGA, but they'll be on the phone to you and you can meet them virtually.
Yeah.
Always go around a school if you can and get a feel for the school and what's on offer there, and ask lots of questions. But I think it was Ronan that mentioned that there really isn't much training in gifted education. What you have to realise is, about 2 years ago, there's a government overhaul into initial teacher education, but there is no requirement to have any sort of gifted education training as part of initial teacher education. So there is a big lack of expertise in this area amongst teachers, but generally most teachers are really invested in your child. They become a teacher because they want to teach and see the best for young people. They just might not have the tools to do it. So they do want to support your child. And then your question was, do you end up mentoring them on this journey together? I think it's really very dependent on case-by-case basis. I've had parents who have moved interstate to come to a school that I've been teaching at because there is a gifted program there and there's just nothing available to them otherwise. And I think that's one of the strengths of CGA, is for children that like Dom said, he would have loved that as a kid. Teachers are constrained. They have to, by law, teach a curriculum. And so they are worried about the 29 other kids in their class that they have to get through this material. And that's not excusing them, because every child has a right to learn, but they haven't been taught how to differentiate for gifted children. They don't know how to add depth and complexity to questions. There is a lot of misconception about acceleration, which I still find hugely frustrating, because I speak to teachers and the number one thing that will hold them back, and they will all say, is, it's not going to be good for them socially, emotionally, Kate. And I'm thinking, actually, you show me the research. Show me the research, because there is over 50 years of research that shows there is nothing detrimental socially and emotionally in accelerating children. In fact, if it's done correctly, it's usually really beneficial for them, because they often feel lonely and isolated amongst peers who don't have the same interests as them. They don't want to listen to Budget Night, and they don't know every single moon of Tatooine, or who killed Franz Ferdinand and what that happened after that. And they're 6. They want to be this is why gifted kids, how you could recognize them at home, they often want to mix with peers who are older than them, or they like adult company, they like deep discussions, they have quite great sense of humor, really dry adult sense of humor. You can make a joke with them in class and the rest of the kids are like, and this kid is smirking away in the background thinking it's hilarious. So acceleration is a really tried and tested great option for these children, and that is the value of an institution like CGA. You can either enroll full-time and then they move through the curriculum in different subjects at the pace that's ready for them, or you can enroll part-time and they can go to school some parts, or talk to Sid about his flexible schooling arrangement that he's managed to set up. So it's really helpful for gifted kids as an option.
Yeah, it leads very much into our next question, which was about acceleration. And can I just see a show of hands? Who has had their child grade skipped so far? Who's had a grade skipped child? Who is asking or advocating for grade skipping at their school currently? Okay, great. Who is worried about any grade skipping because they've told socially it's not the right thing to do? Okay, a few hands as well. Okay. So yeah, grade skipping is certainly something that schools will throw out there as an option. I said, earlier on that I've got a student that I'm speaking to in Queensland who's 8, been grade skipped twice, and still finds it boring and still feels like they can't connect with their peers, because it's really that that social side of it that's probably not as discussed as much, is that, like academically they're not really finding the content that interesting, but socially they're not finding peers that interesting either. They're like, physically, yes, if they go out and play soccer or whatnot, they're going to find people much to their same ability because they're the same age. But when they're talking about things with their peers, they're like, I'm not interested in half of the things that you're talking about. And that's very much a trend. That when I see parents come to us at CGA, it's not just their child is isolated academically, but they're isolated socially. They're like, this is frustrating. And that's what I often think about, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that schools are afraid of grade skipping because if we give it for one kid, then other kids will start asking for it, and other parents will say, but my little Johnny got more than little Mary in that one test 2 years ago, shouldn't they be grade skipped as well? And it becomes this kind of school politics that you have to navigate as well. Is that when we're talking about grade skipping, acceleration, these types of things, how much of it is like a school just saying acceleration or grade skipping is kind of in the too hard basket for us, or we don't want to open Pandora's box, so your kid will just have to do more worksheets in the meantime? Is that a reality when you kind of read between the lines?
If you're talking about a whole grade acceleration, so a grade skip, part of it is a Pandora's box, but every grade skip has to be really well thought through. It's not something that you would just enter into. So you would have to have a psychometric assessment to prove where your child is at. And And it's a really lengthy process that takes a few months. And I would advise anybody doing it to go for look at the Iowa acceleration scale, which is the sort of gold standard process to go through that looks at all sorts of different facets of development when you're grade skipping a child. From, does that child have a sibling that they would end up in the grade with, and how is that going to affect family dynamics, to do they have to change buildings, or how is their physical size compared to the other kids. One thing that I always find really curious as an argument against grade skipping is parents saying, well, when they get to do their HSCs, the other kids will be able to drive and my kid won't. And I always just find that like, I actually have 3 children, and all 3 of them have been accelerated. They've been at school in South Korea and the UK and Australia, and online and single sex and co-ed schools and public and private schools. So they've been to a whole mishmash of probably about 20 schools between the 3 of them. None of them have been affected badly by grade skipping. And that's something else to think about, is if you compare our curriculum to other curriculum in the world, we are starting school later, and some of the things, I'm doing a workshop next week at a school about teaching early mathematics, and our kids in Australia are expected to learn all their times tables by the time they're like 9 or 10 years old. Nearly every other country in Asia, it's like 7 or 8 years old. Same with the UK now, and France. And so if you're asking them to do that early, that's really not that demanding of them compared to other places in the world. So that's also another good comparison to make. But I think a lot of the reluctance to grade skip is because you need to have somebody having an oversight of that in the school, and it has to be followed up. So you have to have an exit strategy if it doesn't work or go according to plan. And genuinely, I think it's this, teachers think that it's bad socially. A couple of years ago, it's a form of grade skipping. I had a child coming into the school who went straight into year 1. She skipped kindergarten. And I worked with this family for a few months before she came to the school. They actually moved for a couple of hours away to be able to access our Gifted Ed program. And she came into the school. I said, come and have a look around before the whole school starts, and you can get to know your teacher and have a look. This child, she was a member of Mensa from age 3. You could tell the minute you met her, verbally, oh, hello, Dr. B. Oh, yes, I've got that book at home, and I've read that one, and oh, look at that robot, and can I go in the STEM lab? And, you could tell, but I took her to meet the year 1 teachers, and even after that meeting, they were all telling me, oh, please put her into kindergarten. Just don't let her start in here, because in kindergarten, it's really important to learn to sit on the mat, and it's really important to learn to wash your hands. And this child, I could tell, she's actually last year had her 2nd grade skip, and she's, skipped year 5 and gone into year 6. So to hold her back would have been awful, but their staff are not familiar with it, I don't think. And so, when you're dealing with someone like CGA, I was like 30 or 40% of your kids they're all going at a different pace that's right for them. But most schools don't have that experience, so they're a bit nervous about it, and they don't want it to go wrong and backfire on them, because one of the worst things you can do is put a child backwards then. You would never do that, and then the child would have to move to a different school. Single subject accelerations are really a possibility. So if you have a child who's really, really strong at maths, and they need it, and I've had a couple of boys a few years ago in year 5 and 6 who were doing year 10 maths, and they were still at the top in the PAT scores in our school. And they're tricky to manage in a conventional school because of timetabling constraints. So trying to get their timetables to align with when the year 10 maths class was, it's really hard to do that. Schools don't have block timetabling. So I think that's why accelerations are really tricky when you're dealing with an institution like a school that has all these constraints around it.
Okay, what about, thinking about intelligence like on a spectrum, which it is, of course. A lot of schools' positions on intelligence and on gifted kids is for the kids who are gifted, definitely, in the 120, 130 range. What about the kids in the 150s, 160s, which is a completely different kettle of fish, these profoundly gifted kids, where a gifted programmer or a gifted teacher might not even be enough for that, or one grade skip. I work with kids, who have had a grade skip, and that's fantastic. Like, that's a good start, basically. But this kid is still floundering, well, many kids I see are still floundering in this, whether it be quantitatively or, I had a kid a couple of years ago who was reading, Proust and Shakespeare and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy at like year 4, year 5 level, you know what I mean? And still having just skipped 1 year, they were still reading like, very good books for that age level, but books that they would come in still so bored with what they were learning that it just, even after the grade skip and even after all the enrichment, it just wasn't applicable to them. So exactly, so that is where, CGA would come absolutely in handy as well, because of the flexibility and the ability to, go at your ability.
When your child is profoundly gifted, it's a different kettle of fish altogether. So if you have a read of books by Miracle Gross on exceptionally gifted children, it's just a really sad collection of vignettes of children who have really had very, very difficult lives and childhoods because they haven't fitted in. Those kids need something completely different. And as parents, you've just got the lottery of life of having this really special, wonderful child that you are going to have to do extra things for. Just like if you had a child with a learning disability, you can send them to school, but you are going to have to give them extra maths remediation, extra reading, extra repetitions, If you have a child at the other end, you're going to have to support them with enrichment. So, Dom can probably help provide some of that enrichment. But there's things like, and these are the things that I would advise parents, start them on a musical instrument, 1, if not 2. And it gets them thinking completely differently, get them learning at least 1 other language. And these are things that you can do quite cheaply if you get Duolingo, if not 2 very different languages. Get them learning a Latin language and an Asian language, something quite different. Get them doing sports. They still need to be doing lots of physical activity too, especially for things like, basic writing and stamina and, pencil grips in small kids. They need good core strength. So, keep them interested in lots of different things and take them as many places as you can that meets their particular interest. So when that exhibition on ancient Greeks is in Sydney or Canberra, get down there and go to it and, take them out on excursions, challenge them to think about things, get the paper and discuss things with them. I've got some books, magazines at the back called Euler. These are really good magazines that cover a whole field of science, humanities, everything, and they just introduce kids to a broad, wide range of what's out there in the world at their sort of target age. So it makes them think about lots of things. Get them doing lots of puzzles and games, get them doing Wordle every day, identify each world, country in the world, Wordle, all of those sorts of different things. But you have the joy of watching this very unique person flower, but it is going to take some fertilizing and some watering and some guidance, because unfortunately school is not probably going to bend to meet their needs. What you can ask for in your schools is somebody like a mentor, if they might have a particular interest. So that kid who was really passionate, and he did make, when he was 6 years old, a video about the causes of World War I and assassinating people, etc. He was set up with a high school science teacher just to meet twice, 2 or 3 times a term, and have, get onto a project. Somebody that can, mentorship is really valuable. If you can find another trusted adult, that's great. And when that really comes in handy is when they get to those adolescent years and their peers become more important. Even when they're gifted and they don't feel like they fit in with their peers, you are not going to be Mr. or Mrs. Cool then. 12, 13, 14, they're going to look to somebody else for that guidance. And if you have somebody, an adult figure there that shares their passion or interest, that's great. So
yeah, I would just to add on that, Kate, we used to, pre-COVID, have a fair few connections with PhD students up at UNSW, and they'd be mentors to 12, 13-year-old kids. And, you know, I watched a couple of these interactions, and it was like, you know, watching water start to flow for the first time, you know what I mean? It was the kind of rapport that they build immediately, because these PhD students, you know, again, the kids wouldn't feel condescended to, and there was just this easy back and forth. And as you said, a mentor role is so important for gifted kids, especially around that kind of, you know, burgeoning puberty kind of area. So yeah, things like that. Unfortunately, we never kind of got that back going after COVID, but it's such a good, we should look back into it. But yeah, it's such a good avenue.
The other thing to look at is UNSW has courses.
Jared.
Jerick run holiday courses in January and July. They're 3 days long each. If you live in Sydney, it's great because you don't have to pay for accommodation. And they're a really good chance to think outside the box. They're not curriculum-led courses, and they get to meet other gifted kids. That's what I find is the real benefit, especially if they feel like they're the only one like that and they're a bit weird in their school. They suddenly realise there's actually a whole other bunch of kids out here that think like me. So that's really helpful as well.
Yeah, Ronan.
I'd say just very much on the same line, but also from the teacher perspective. In my A-level biology class last year, which is usually 17 to 18-year-olds, the age range I had was 14 to 18. The students didn't mind. They interacted with each other as they normally would in any class. I didn't mind because they're all doing the work that they needed to be doing. And, it was the right level for those students. The student who was 14 also then scored the top mark in the world, in the A-level subject. So it allowed him to work at the level that he was able to, but then also give him those opportunities to think about that extension beyond. So, we run what we call the extended project qualification. That is a project that students choose for themselves. It can be a research project, it can be a creative project. They're given a mentor for the project, but it is self-led. They choose, they research, they write it up with guidance, and that really allows them to explore different concepts that they are really interested in depth. If they do the research one, it's about 5,000-6,000 words they need to write. So it's really a process they enjoy. Usually what you find is they produce something that's about 10 to 12,000 words and then have to sit and cut it back down again, but such is life. And yeah, it allows that thinking of project-based learning as well, that can really add on to the courses they're doing. One of our students now, he's developed a e-recycling, so electronic recycling campaign that he wants to get up and running for students in Japan, because that's where his extended project led him to, and now that's the next step for him alongside his academics, that's what he wants to focus on. And as Alex said, we're lucky in that we have that flexibility. Students can accelerate for all their subjects, or it could just be for one or two. We tend to look at students as well from the social side and think, okay, are they socially at their year level, 1 or 2 year levels above, so that those pastoral sessions, the learning for life, the form time, are also at the right level for them by ability, not just by age. So it's looking as well as where is the best place for them to be with their true peers rather than the age peer, to make sure that they're getting that real enjoyment in the discussions that they have as well.
This is awesome. I love this. Who's enjoying it so far? Hey, here we are. Good stuff. I'm loving this. These guests are fantastic.
Alex, I've got to jump in there, because Ronan, the other thing that CGA offers that I really should shout about, which is great, is AP courses. So AP courses they're called advanced placement courses, and they're something that children do at high school in America usually. They're a college level course, so they're typically first year university level-ish courses. And they are taken for kids who want to go to Ivy League universities at high school in America. But they are offered by CGA, and because of the time difference with America, it actually works out kind of useful in Australia, that they often run like 7 till 8:30 in the morning, so you can do them before school. And the courses are really interesting. Because they're like global courses, human geography, all about refugees and food production across the world, macroeconomics. There's a really great one that is world history, which is like 2,000 years of history compacted into 1 year of learning. They run with the North American school calendar. So they start in September and finish in May. Your child can get a qualification then, which is recognized worldwide. But those people act as mentors, so the teachers of them are university lecturers usually, aren't they? Well, they're really great people for your kids to meet. And the sort of subject matter that they cover are the sorts of things that gifted kids are really interested in. So that's another thing that you can look at through CGA, that if your child is in high school, it's a really great offering.
Yes.
And I'll probably just say one other point on that as well, as it links into the other end, because I think sometimes the danger with acceleration is, what's the plan? What's the thought process around if they've skipped 2 year groups, when are they going to university? Is it going to be early? Is it going to be later? How does that fit with them finishing school early? And what we have actually discussed with families is, okay, if they're going to take these higher level quals, they might, as Alex gave the example earlier, do twice as many as is normal, because that gives them the right challenge, but the right time where they want to go to university. And with the APs as well, it allows that mix and match. They can do A levels, they can do APs, they can do HSC and one or both. I currently have a student who is 11 years old, who's already doing his A levels, which are meant for 17, 18 years. I'm working with his parents to say, okay, well, what's the youngest you'd be happy for him to go to university? Because I don't see any other way out of this. It's going to be before he's 18, but what's the youngest we can aim for? And then we have to look at what we can fill in there that is interesting for him with APs, with A levels, and we do have one sort of specialist course for maths that he's already keen to do, which is actually the University of Stanford, because we have a relationship with them, that they can do the first year Stanford University A level or maths beyond school as well. So it's building that entire profile, but plan, that there is a plan there for, yes, acceleration is needed, but where does it end up? And making sure that that's there for the parents and for us as the school as well. We're all working together and towards that plan.
Yeah, excellent point. I mean, it kind of that also, it trusts the volition of the gifted kid in themselves, that they know quite what direction they want to go in. This question of what am I going to do if I skip 2 years, etc. I think CGA is great because it runs with the idea that they have a general idea of where they want to be, what they want to study, where their interests, where their passions lie. And some kids I meet have that as young as 4, 5, 3, young ages where they are so passionate on subjects that they know where they're going. And I remember a couple of years ago working with a highly gifted boy in a normal education school, and he was kind of bemusing to me why all this pressure is ramped up around making decisions, and he saw a big irony, which they often do, in being in year 12, and he was like, Tom, they were telling me how much this year matters and how much I've got to make all these big adult decisions, and then I had to ask to go to the toilet. And that kind of dichotomous relationship of, all right, well, am I an adult or am I still a kid that has to ask to go potty? He couldn't quite conceptualize that as autonomy for himself.
Yeah, exactly. It's a funny, like we were saying earlier today, I think, Fiona, we were chatting about, like, at what point do schools, majority of times, are able to cater to gifted kids? One standard deviation? Yeah, like, OC classes. I think we've got a question up here. Thank you, by the way, for taking full advantage of the Slido, as we can see the questions come in from our audience, so thank you for that. But certainly, like, there's some things that are set up within schools to cater to students who are probably high achievers, OC classes, these types of things. And then some programs within schools, like the gifted education programs that yourself, Rhiannon, run, that are tailored towards more gifted kids. But there's 2 standard deviations or more, like more than that, 3, 4. Like, majority of schools are like, you don't know what we're going to do with you. Like, we've kind of run out of ideas a little bit. And so it is really interesting to kind of look at acceleration. A common question that we get from our part-time students who are with CGA after hours is like, if I do like year 10 or 11 maths with you, won't it make year 6 or year 7 maths even like more boring than it already is? I say, well, at least you're getting the challenge. This, at least we're investigating where your child's potential actually is.
The way they get around that usually is they do their homework in the school
they
class.
take the CGA homework to class.
They take the CGA homework to class.
I was going to say, we have been lucky that for some of our parents whose child is accelerating in certain subjects with us, we then have a conversation with the school, or the parents have a conversation with the school, and they're happy for them to drop that subject in school, knowing they're doing it elsewhere at a higher level, and exactly that can then use that time productively for their CGA class and the homework. So, and again, not every school will say yes to that, but if you're lucky enough to have one that does, it works really well.
Yeah, the school worry with that, I think, Ronan, is this going to open the floodgates? Are we going to get all... And it's a shame, because really you want the best for each of those kids. And I think the question, ends up as a deeply personal one for every family about values and, what are the other things that your children gain from school? And, is your child really settled in good friendships there? And do they have lots of opportunities in the drama club and the sport and other things that you can maintain them at school, or are they really unhappy and then you need to move them, or advocate for the grade skipping, or if it doesn't happen then move them. So it's a really individual decision.
That's what I ask mostly all parents I talk to in the follow-up sessions is like, are they going to school willingly each morning, or are you having massive tantrums, meltdowns, mostly daily? Then there is something rotten in the state of Denmark. Something needs to be changed. You know what I mean? But if they're getting up and going willingly, even grumblingly, there's something that they're going for, whether that be a friend or a relationship or talking to the librarian, or something's drawing them in. And it's when that ends or that starts to crack, or they start getting older and they realize how entrenched that boredom and frustration is, that's when you start seeing a lot more school refusal and things like that.
The worrying thing, there is a phenomena that's very well researched called the performance cliff, and it usually kicks in about year 8 and year 9, and this is when children have not been challenged at school in junior school. And if they just float along, some kids have a really lovely disposition and they're just quite happy doing what they're doing, even though they're gifted, and they'll just go along and they're very compliant and will do this because the teacher asked, and they never have to work for anything or try. And then they get to usually about year 8 and year 9 and the wheels fall off, because that's when the work starts to get a little bit more complex and they can't just do it immediately based on their own, who can think up Pythagoras' theorem themselves. So they just... actually that's a bad example because they can just follow that formula quite easily. But that there really is this performance cliff, and that's about when it kicks in. And unfortunately, it usually coincides with huge hormonal variations, and the time in adolescence when they're forming a sense of identity, and their identity is always been tied up with I'm the smart one, or I can get stuff done, or I'm easy, I'm top of the class, and then it all goes out the window. So it is important to make sure, even if they're happy, make sure they're at their point of learning all the time. They're learning something new at school all the time, not just floating along doing the busy work. And Alex had a question about what busy work looks like. Busy work is just more of the same. So, if asking your child to do 20 questions instead of 10, or write a 1,000-word essay when everyone else is doing 600. They actually need more depth and complexity of thought within the questions, and it's that sort of differentiation that staff aren't always trained to know how to do at schools.
Yeah, we would say it as you want every student to be working in an area where they have productive struggle. So it shouldn't be everything's so easy, or it shouldn't be everything's too difficult. It should be a challenge to do that requires some sort of feedback or reflection, really trying to build in metacognition earlier. So as you say, whenever they hit those harder topics, they understand this is hard, but this is how I get through, and they've started to build those skills as well as the knowledge base that they already have.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, when I see a lot of kids after school, And sometimes I prefer seeing them before school because, after school they're often from a certain level of masking really, really drawn out. But it's interesting because they've been structured in such a way throughout the day that they've had to kind of follow these very tangible avenues of I can think this, but I can't ask this. They often, you see this explosion in the therapy room where they're just like, why, Dom? Why are we doing this? Why this? And I have the time, obviously, in the prerogative and the one-on-one environment to answer those questions, and they leave very elated because of that, that intellectual satiety. And it's just situational and environmental as well, of course. As you said, teachers want to be able to answer these questions. They're just in an environment where there's 30 other kids that they have to deal with, and they don't quite know exactly how to imbue those answers that they give with that existential depth that a gifted kid, well, they want to know the inner workings of things and why this happens. And they can be really annoying in the classroom as well because they can point out ironies and things that don't work.
I was thinking the worst phrase that a teacher can say is "because I said so" or "just do it."
Yeah.
That does not.
No.
It doesn't hit. It needs to be more. It needs to be that relationships built. I will explain it, or if I can't explain it now, I will explain it to you later. Just because I'm busier right now, a clear explanation of understanding and acknowledgement of them and the value of their question.
The biggest difference teaching a gifted class, I find, is the pace. You might need to do like 10 repetitions in a normal class for them to understand a concept. Gifted kids will just get it like that. So you're straight onto problem solving things. And the other thing is making, digging into complexities of problems or layering complexities into whatever you're teaching. So when you look at your child's work that comes back, if it's very flat sort of questioning and no problem solving or application in mathematics or something, that's not helpful for them. Or in an English so an example would be like your child's writing an essay on COVID, compare the different responses of countries to the COVID pandemic. But a gifted kid, you would sort of ask, well, compare the different responses of countries to COVID and how they changed over time as the pandemic progressed. And the really highly gifted kids, you would say, compare the different responses of the countries over the time as the pandemic progressed from the point of view of a politician, a healthcare worker, and an elderly person. So that's what I mean by layering on the complexity of thought. It's adding extra difficulty.
Very serendipitously, Kate, I actually had this conversation with a gifted kid a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about COVID. And okay, well, why don't you explain to me what you think? They were about 12, I think. And they didn't want to just understand how COVID affected the world. They wanted to know how collective versus individualistic societies and cultures responded to COVID-19, which obviously this kid was in, year 6, I think, year 5. And other kids would be like, why do you want to know that? Who cares? What are you talking about? But they really want to know how, a collectivist nation like China reacted and how an individualistic nation like the USA reacted and the differences and why culturally that happened, which is, kind of part and parcel.
Well, we are we've run a little bit long on the panel, so we might have to get to some of these questions during the break when you have a chance to speak to our lovely guests. But I am interested to approach the top question, which is a 2 or 3-parter there. How were twice exceptional ADHD gifted children viewed within the gifted community? And what should parents be asking for when choosing schools, public versus private versus online? Who would like to have a first go at that?
The more I have taught gifted kids, the more I've thought that twice exceptional is the normal. Even though the research says, not, but, there's sort of about 20%, but there is a huge overlap between giftedness and ADHD, and last week for Gifted Awareness Week, I put out on my Substack a different resource for teachers every day, and the one that got way more hits than the rest, I quickly printed off a poster of it because I had feedback from parents. It's a Venn diagram you can see over there looking at the overlap between giftedness and ADHD and the traits of twice exceptionality in the middle. How are they viewed within the gifted community? What should they be? I think the biggest difficulty is getting your teacher to understand the child, and that's why it's really important that you cultivate a relationship with your child's teacher, or in junior school that'll be their homeroom teacher, but in high school they should have one sort of pastoral care teacher or somebody that is representing them, so that teachers can understand the behaviour that they see in the classroom and what it is rooted in. And those children who are twice exceptional need support for their disability, be it ASD or ADHD, and that might mean differential seating, different timings, all sorts of accommodations that they will need. They might need physical help with, writing if they have a particular, a specific learning difficulty, that they might need to have their intellectual capacity captured in a different way. So if they can't write very well to keep up with their thoughts, they need to be able to record that verbally or have somebody scribe it for them, because you need them to be assessed on their thinking rather than their presentation, on their outputs like that. So you need to be really working in a partnership to understand that child and provide as many reports from psychologists and allied health professionals that you can to ensure that they're getting the support for their disability, but at the same time they're getting the extension and enrichment that they need for their thought processes, because it's very easy for that to be masked.
And yeah, absolutely, Kate. And also you'll find a lot of those behavioural affectations of twice exceptional students actually lessen when they do get that intellectual satiation. You know what I mean? Schools will often be like, oh, we have to figure out the logistics and the social side before we give them the intellectual satiation. If you give them the intellectual satiation, oftentimes that will mitigate and lessen the other factors, but it's quite a case of chicken and the egg with them. So,
and that's a way that you can tell if the child is gifted or ADHD, because so often they look the same. They're excitable, they can't control themselves when it's something they're interested in, they jump out of their seat, they're hyper-focused on things, highly creative. But the difference is a gifted child, when they're engaged in that thing, they will calm down and just knuckle down and get on with it. A child with ADHD still isn't able to do that because their brains are wired differently. And the biggest hurdle I think I have with parents is convincing them that, ADHD is not a bad thing. That it's just a difference in your child, but that allows them to do things that other kids can't do. They can push through projects that other kids won't because they are so hyper-focused on them. So I'd look at that positive. I really don't hold any judgment. The child is the way the child is. And they're great, so play to their strengths. You have to play to their strengths.
Yeah, I think probably one of the key questions, if you're looking at transitioning to a new school and you're asking about what type of school is best, it really is that inclusion conversation. What strategies are used in the school? What sort of access arrangements are there that the student can access, as you said, to be able to express in the way that works for them best, not just, well, everyone writes their answers, that's how it is. So, and that will tell you very quickly the sort of level of support and way that the school might be willing to work with you as a family then as well.
I was just going to touch on the last question that just came through. As a temporary resident, our child won't be eligible for the OC program, which sucks. What kind of academic support and challenge should we arrange for them in the meantime? I mean, interesting personally, I didn't even try to sit the OC program because I was so disillusioned with education at that time that I thought it would be more work. So Fiona was fantastic during that time of very exorbitant boredom, that she would do things outside of the box, as Kate actually touched on. Like, we'd go to the zoo fortnightly, and I joined like the zoo club, and I talk to people there. It's things that you can do to satiate certain intellectual stagnations that are there for your kid. I mean, again, maybe a tutor or some kind of mentor to just take the edge off the boredom that they might be experiencing, unless there's no other path of enrichment at the school, because you'll be here only temporarily. There's lots of programs you can find that are run. I remember a similar situation. Someone joined like a mixed age group chess club that was down at the local community centre, and the kid was able to to meet lots of varying ages and talk about things. So it's important to kind of think outside the box to find different avenues of satiation for gifted kids if the school is unable to provide that.
A lot of universities, as part of their outreach, will host lecture series that have open Q&As at the end as well on specialist topics on the research that's happening at the university. That's whenever I worked in the UK, that was a bus full of kids, driving them 2 hours to Cambridge to hear the lecture series and driving them back again, but that they all enjoyed it. They all had questions every time. So there's things like that as well that can be happening quite locally around where you are and the local universities. That can be great for them to actually be able to engage, go up and ask some questions one-to-one after to the lecturers. It's a really nice way to get that sort of like conversation level that they're looking for as well.
And there's a huge value, I think, to looking at doing volunteering in your community or doing things with your community, because a lot of society is very individualistic, and it's about what can I do and what can I get and how, about my progression. Kids feel very empowered when they can do something, be it volunteering at your local animal shelter, walking the dogs, feeding them, cleaning them out, or working with homeless people in a soup kitchen. Or I would really encourage them to do something like that. It's really important that they don't get too focused on themselves. And that's a really big danger nowadays with social media, because everything seems to be about me and how do I look and what's my brand, etc. But to let them feel that they're part of a bigger society, you're part of something.
Absolutely. I like to use the metaphor with the kids I work with that, in all the movies and TV shows, if you go back in time, you can't do a single tiny thing because it'll mess up the future, right? Which is the same kind of premise, that a small act and a small homage in real time can make a huge difference. So lots of kids I work with are really worried about climate change. And their parents then, after, they kind of unveil that, we'll take them down to the beach and they'll join people, like say down at Coogee Beach every Sunday, who go and clean up the beach. And this gives the kids such a feeling of collectiveness.
An achievement as well. Look at Sid found his dead possum and it turned into over $1,000 for the wildlife shelter. I bet they were really grateful. So it is quite empowering for them to see that they can make a difference in this world, because especially gifted kids, a lot of them are really worried about climate change and environment and the way the world is going. And there are other opportunities for, academic things that you can do online, which are fairly low cost sort of competitions and things that they can do to keep their brain ticking over if that's the sort of challenges that you're interested in. But try and keep them socially connected. And one of the best things you can do is find them another gifted kid.
Yes, that's a good point.
Oh, yeah.
There. We
Afternoon
will
tea.
break. I will just add, the last point that I'll probably add is that oftentimes a lot of parents come to, I run a large Facebook group, like Sydney School Discussion Group. Got about 30,000 members, and a lot of parents I can see are laser focused on getting their kid into OC, getting their kid into selective schools, getting a 99.95 ATAR. And I think in Australia, unfortunately, those are seen as like the academic goals to aim for. But I really like what you said, Kate, where it's like when you have a gifted child, you can treat them as if they've got a learning disability. In that, like, yes, it's not the learning disability that we often think about of being like, you have to try and help a child catch up. But it's often like you need to support your child beyond what is currently offered by the education system. So the education system says, oh yeah, OC class. A lot of parents say, great, I got my kid into OC, job done, right? But that's really just the beginning. And it can be, whether it be part-time CGA or whether it be extension programs through GERIC or attending the zoo and all the rest of it, having not your child attend the OC program is actually like probably a good problem to have in a way, because it will, as the guests have all discussed, make you think more creatively about, okay, OC is not going to happen, what can we do instead? Same kind of thing for selective schools. Same kind of thing, instead of like aiming for a 99.95 ATAR, what are some other areas that might be more specific to your child that looks like academic achievement or academic fulfillment, or not even just academic, fulfillment, full stop, that it might look like for them? So definitely some things to think about. I know we're going to have some productive discussions during the break. Please see our lovely expo stall holders that are around the room. Please come and speak to our guests, obviously. And we'll see you back at 3:15. Please enjoy the catering.